Mr. Selmann, a growing number of Americans are concerned about the effects of partisanship on politics and fear that politicians focus on beating the other side more than serving the people. Where do you stand on partisanship?
I think partisanship is one of the biggest hindrances to actually getting stuff done. Part of it is the funding that goes in the political process now comes generally from the far right interests or far left interests, and that makes the economy of running for politics mean you need to pander to those interests. Mr. Manweller has been very successful in raising lots of money by doing just that. He mentioned his sitting on the Washington Policy Center board. Washington Policy Center is a member of the American Legislative Exchange Council. I don't know if any of you saw the Bill Moyer special on it last night, but this is basically an organization where a legislator can pay $50 a year to join and then have a company fly them out to a resort and provide child care and give scholarships to attend these meetings where they offer model legislation for these legislators to come back and introduce to their agencies. I think that's a totally corruption and perversion of the process. I understand he's a political science professor, he knows the process and knows that this is how the system works. I just don't think the system is working for us. I don't think the system is working for the people. And I think we actually need some citizens who are involved as part of a citizen legislature who actually understand and have a real idea of what the impact on the ground for the real people are and are not bought and paid for before they're even ever elected to office.
Dr. Manweller?
So do I get 1 or 2 minutes?
1 minute.
Okay. Of the two of us, I'm the only one up here who actually has a record of bipartisanship. As people know, I'm a Republican, but I was elected as the president of the Faculty Senate by the CWU faculty, which is overwhelmingly Democratic and liberal. So you have an organization of 400 professors, of which 350 of them are Democrats, and they elected myself, a Republican, to serve as their leader. I also have a record of bipartisanship in Olympia and working in the legislature. I was hired by universities here in Washington to go to Olympia and advocate on behalf of higher education. And I spent far more of my time in the offices of Democratic senators and representatives than I did Republicans. And in fact, became very good friends with Reuben Carlisle, who is a liberal inner-city Seattle Democrat, and we helped craft higher ed policy in 2010. We testified together, arm in arm, before the House Higher Ed Committee, and we actually briefed the caucus together. So I actually have a record of bipartisanship that I'm very proud of. Thank you.
As a follow-up question, Mr. Selmann, if your party took a stand that was at odds with the position that you and your constituents support, how would you handle it?
How are you in favor of supporting the constituents, the people? The district is what you're here to represent. You're not here to represent your political party. You're not here to represent your donors. You're here to represent the people of the 13th district, and that's exactly what I think I should do. That's what I'm afraid we're not going to get if I'm not put in this office. And so that's one of the primary reasons I'm running. You know, Matt mentioned his time as an advocate for Central Washington University, and I want to make the point that the results of that, how that, you actually look at what happened out of that. The year after that, there was $500,000 retention bonus that went to the president of the university. They spent $50,000 on furniture for the presidential mansion, paid for by the taxes for the president of the university, and there was a 14% increase on the tuition for the students. So, I mean, if we want to talk about the effectiveness of advocacy, I think it comes back a lot more down to what actually gets done and what you say and what kind of platitudes you put out there.
Dr. Manweller?
No response to that. Well, again, you know, I didn't give the president a $500,000 raise. In fact, I was involved in trying to protest that raise. You know, here's a better example. When I was president of the Faculty Senate in 2008, which was when the horrible recession first hit, and we faced serious funding cuts, what I suggested as the president of the faculty was that we give back our negotiated raises. I went to my colleagues and I said, we negotiated a 3.4% raise, but we can't afford it. We should give it back. And who was floored was the president of the university. And of course, my fellow union members and faculty members didn't take warmly to my suggestion, but there was only one faculty president in the entire state of Washington that said, hey, let's work together. This is a community crisis. We were given a raise. Let's give that raise back. There are other people hurting worse than we are.
Mr. Selmann, the recent state economic forecast projected a deficit of approximately $800 million. What would you do to resolve that deficit as a member of the House?
Well, my background is in small business. My background is in trying to figure out some innovative solutions in terms of how we can actually make things work better. Obviously, especially when people are hurting economically, just raising taxes and figuring out a way to extract more money from the population isn't going to be the best path forward. But it means that we still have to fund these water solutions, and we still have to fund education. So what it means is we actually have to start being innovative. You hear people talk about running the government should run more like a business. And I'd say, okay, let's take people that face value and let's start looking at some of that. One of the things that I like other state models that have done well. One is the state bank in North Dakota. The state bank in North Dakota isn't something that is a, the argument against it is that you don't want the government in a position of picking winners or losers, but that's not actually how this would function. This would function as something that is a backing agency for local banks who are the first people with their money on the line first. But the state can step in to back up those to basically guarantee those loans and back those loans. And then the state gets to drive the revenue off of the portion that they're backing, and that goes back into the general fund. An extrapolation from what is going into the North Dakota fund over the last 10 years versus if you extrapolate, so they've had about $20 million a year that goes back into their fund. Our economy is roughly tenfold the size of the economy in North Dakota. So if we had that tenfold increase and had that same kind of revenue generation, you're talking about a $200 million increase into the revenue, which goes a long way toward paying for infrastructure projects, a long way for paying for education without actually having to reach in your pocket and pull out a dime. It means that the money stays in the state instead of going to New York or someplace else.
Dr. Manweller?
1 minute?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I hope we get a chance to talk about the state bank more. It's a horrible idea. In fact, the Democratic elected state treasurer of our state has said there's no way that he's going to risk Washington money on a state bank. But your question was actually how would we cut funding in the state legislature? How do we cut costs, right? And there are 4 things we could do. 1, we can contract out. The private sector does things cheaper, more efficiently, and we've done studies that says contracting out will save anywhere from 18 to 25% depending on the industry that you're contracting out to. Second, we need legislative approval of collective bargaining agreements. Right now what we have is this. We have state employees unions who donate millions of dollars to the governor, and then they sit down across the table from the governor and say, tell us what our salary should be. And of course the governor says, well, whatever you want it to be since you funded my, my election. We need to go back to the way it was prior to 2002, where collective bargaining agreements have to be represented by ratified by the people's body, not just by the governor. And I would also say we could suspend the prevailing wage laws. That'll save 30%, and we need pension reform. Could I ask a question? I mean, he keeps getting asked for, so he gets 2 minutes and I get 1 minute.
I need to apologize to the candidates, particularly Dr. Manweller. I've been giving Mr. Selmann all the questions, and so now I'm going to,
Please.
He's done the rebuttal. Now he gets a question, and he gets 2 minutes on this question. Dr. Manweller, growing pressure is focused on decreasing or eliminating federal subsidies in an effort to reduce the federal deficit and role of the federal government in local affairs. Federal subsidies are important to our local farming economy, however. If federal subsidies were eliminated or significantly reduced, would you support state subsidies? Why or why not?
Probably not. Subsidies distort markets, and they do so in a bad way. And the thing about subsidies is that everybody agrees that they're not a good idea. But the problem is unilateral disarmament harms your own domestic farmers. So American farmers are the best farmers in the world. They could compete with the Germans, the French, the Latin Americans, the Asians, the Europeans, no problem. The problem is that you have other countries that are beyond our control that offer significant subsidies, particularly the French. And if we unilaterally get rid of our subsidies, then we're at the mercy of foreign governments who are providing them. So if we could come to an international agreement where everybody gets rid of their subsidies, then I'm on board. But as long as other countries are offering subsidies, even though we don't want to, we would have to continue to do it, just so that we didn't put our own agricultural people at a disadvantage. That's the difficulty with subsidies, is you have to get an almost universal agreement to get rid of them, but only one defector can implode the whole system. Now, we've tried to move in this direction with the WTO and with trade agreements and international courts, but again, the enforcement mechanism on these international courts is not that great. Case in point, the South Koreans are trying to embargo our potatoes again because they say there's a potential for chip disease, and they can just drop this embargo on us and put our entire potato industry, into a stressful situation. Now, we've got the State Department working on it, we've got local people working on it, but again, subsidy policy probably has to be taken care of at the international or national level, not the state level. Thank you.
And your 1 minute rebuttal, Mr. Selmann.
So when we get down to, let's actually talk about the stuff that affects our district. And we're talking about how this kind of the difference in philosophy really impacts people. So in 2009, we passed the stimulus spending bill, and we're arguing about how we should spend the money. Manweller wrote an article for the Washington Times, and he was arguing that basically government infrastructure policy don't work. In fact, he even called out dams specifically as bad policy. Our district is built on dams and irrigation projects. And when we were talking about how that stimulus money was going to be spent, instead of advocating for those dollars to come to our district and maybe finish out the High Canal, the Columbia Basin irrigation project, so we can actually increase our irrigation, we could double the amount of cropland that we have in irrigation. We could get some water back into the ground, recharging aquifer. Instead, he spent his energies focused on the, greater political philosophy of saying that basically dams don't work, irrigation projects don't work, these are a bad way to spend stimulus dollars. So instead of actually advocating for the people of this district, he's more interested in political philosophy.
Mr. Selmann, your 2 minute question. Healthcare costs are often blamed for economic challenges to state and federal governments, the private sector, and individuals. What is the best way to control healthcare costs in the 13th district?
So this would be my solution for how we should handle healthcare costs. It is really a good idea to use market forces to help drive down the cost of healthcare costs, but we also have to provide some sort of basic safety nets. One of the things the government actually does well is provide a really big pool. So if I was to propose something to actually fix something for Washington State, I would say that we should have a state insurance that insured everybody against catastrophic costs, and that could be done through direct insurance or through a reinsurance program with insurers. But basically, if you have costs say over $50,000, that's where the state insurance would actually step in and kick in and start working. But then you could use, for your day-to-day care isn't something that you want the government in the middle of. So that's something that you can either use private insurance to fill that gap, or people who are able to shoulder that burden on their own could actually have their own, use that as market forces and use that to make better healthcare decisions. For example, one time when I hurt my back, I went in and the doctor suggested I have an MRI, and unfortunately I'm in the position of saying, well, how much will an X-ray tell us versus an MRI? And he says, well, it'll tell us 80% of the time, what the MRI will tell us. And the cost difference is a tenfold cost difference. So I said, why don't we start with the X-ray first before we actually get to the MRI? And having people actually responsible for that is one of the ways that you can use market forces to drive down the cost without making the insurance burden so high because of the catastrophic potential. Spreading that catastrophic potential across the widest pool that you can, while allowing people to make their own decisions about their personal health care. That's the system I would like to see put in place.
Dr. Manweller, you have 1 minute rebuttal.
Yeah, unfortunately, I got to go back to the last question. You of my time, I'm not against dams. I'm a huge supporter of dams. Doc Casey and I have been huge supporters of dams. I don't know where Mr. Selmann makes this stuff up. But in terms of the healthcare question, how do you lower healthcare costs at the state level? Well, one, we could institute tort reform so that doctors could focus on treating people rather than paying large insurance premiums themselves. So let's do tort reform. Two, let's get rid of the Deborah Sen reforms of 1992. In 1992, I'll remind you that there were 23 healthcare providers in Washington. After Deborah Sen instituted her reforms and mandates, that has fallen to 3. Think about that. We went from 23 providers to 3 in a matter of 2 years. In fact, the exodus was so bad that Gary Locke had to step in and overrule his own insurance commissioners because there was a massive flight of providers from Washington State. Let's get those providers back so we have competition and choice like we did back in 1992. And then 3, let's create differentiated products. Let's not make everybody buy a Jaguar. If you make everybody buy a Jaguar, most people won't have a car. If you make everybody buy the same Cadillac healthcare plan, a lot of people won't have healthcare. You know, my first car was a Dodge Colt, but it was better than no car at all. Thanks.
Dr. Manweller, this is your 2-minute question. And some local school districts have recently been unsuccessful in passing bonds to address overcrowding in the schools. What strategies do you support to meet the needs of school districts with rapidly growing student populations in the 13th district?
I'm really glad you asked this question. This question is dear to my heart. I have 2 children in the back. You probably hear them interrupting. They're 1 and 3. And we live in a town where our middle school is 100 years old. And it's been declared structurally unsound, okay? That they're afraid it's going to fall on the kids. And all 3 of our attempts to pass a bond have failed, okay? And the reason is that these price tags are coming in at $60, $70 million for a middle school. In Moses Lake, the bond that we put forward for our high school was $170 million, and it failed. So here's the one idea that will take care of that, and it's a win-win situation. I plan to introduce as my first piece of legislation a bill that says we will suspend the prevailing wage laws on the construction of all public schools. And study after study, nonpartisan study, has shown that if you suspend the prevailing wage laws, it will lower the cost of construction projects anywhere from 28 to 37%. So imagine that $60 million middle school bond in Ellensburg would have been $40 million. That $170 million bond here would have been more around $120 million. And these bonds are just missing. They're missing by 3 or 4 percentage points. So if we came in with a lower price tag, it's win-win. It's lower cost for the taxpayers, and it's good schools for the students and the teachers. And so the answer is not to make it easier to spend tax dollars. The answer is to make it easier to spend less tax dollars. And by suspending the prevailing wage laws, which distort the market, we could get the same quality of schools, but at 1/3 of the price, and then our bonds would pass. Thank you.
Mr. Selmann, your 1-minute rebuttal.
So, reforming these prevailing wage laws is one of those things that sounds good, but when you actually start looking at the real world consequences of it, it starts to get a whole lot less attractive. So, a couple things. Let's talk the Walmart that was built in Yakima, for example. This is something where, this is what happens when you say we don't have to be prevailing wage, we'll just go where we can get the cheapest labor available. So the cheapest labor available to build the Walmart in Yakima wasn't from people in Yakima. It was from people in Florida that they could come up and hire and put a couple of them in a hotel room for $30 a night, and they could actually cut their costs to build that Walmart by doing it that way. But that means all those jobs aren't for Washington residents. Those are jobs that go to Florida. I mean, that's money that leaves the state. So when he's talking about a 28 to 30% reduction in overall cost, that's an overall labor cost. That's not an overall project cost to begin with. And second, when you look down at this is an instant. So it's a Jamie. You also end up with people that are the $10 guys building your school for you instead of the guys that can charge $26 an hour to build your school for you. Which one do you want your kids sitting under? Which roof do you want your kids sitting under? That's the